Hi guys, welcome to Whispered History. American history told slowly and quietly, one story at a time.
Whispered History.
A woman in Ohio buried 3 of her 5 children before any of them turned 10. That wasn't a tragedy. That was just Tuesday. That was 1840s America. We like to think about the past as simpler, slower, somehow gentler than the world we live in now. But step into 1843 for just 1 hour and you'd probably beg to come home. There was no such thing as a safe birth. No such thing as a routine fever. A splinter in your thumb could kill you by Friday. People didn't fear death the way we do. They lived inside it. They shook hands with it at the dinner table. And yet somehow, in the middle of all that fragility, they built farms. They built towns. They built a country that would eventually stretch from one ocean to the other. How does a person get out of bed every single morning knowing the odds are stacked that high against them? I'm going to tell you exactly how they did it. Not the version from your old history textbook, with its neat little chapters and its safe distance from the truth. The real one. The one with the smell of tallow candles and the sound of a well rope creaking in the dark. The one where a broken leg could mean the end of your family's entire harvest season, and a good pair of boots could mean the difference between walking to church and never leaving your cabin all winter. Before we go any further, I want to say something quickly, quietly, and only once. If stories like this one, stories that slow your mind down and pull you gently into another time, are the kind of thing that helps you drift off at night, you might want to stay close. This channel is called Whispered History, and what we do here is simple. We sit with the past, we let it breathe, and if you find that you like sitting there with us, there's a button nearby that keeps the porch light on for the next story. Now, let's go back. 1843. A one-room cabin somewhere in the Ohio River Valley. It's 4 a.m, and there is no such thing as sleeping in. A woman named Sarah, we'll come back to her, because her story is one of the threads running through everything I'm about to tell you, is already awake, already dressed, already working before the sun has decided to show up. Her hands are cracked from lye soap. Her knuckles ache in a way that no one in her family has ever thought to question, because everyone's knuckles ache. That's just what hands look like when you're 34 years old in this century. There's no coffee maker, no faucet, no light switch. There's a well outside, half frozen at the edges, and a hearth that has to be coaxed back to life every single morning like a stubborn old animal. The smell in that cabin is thick and specific. Wood smoke, tallow fat, damp wool drying too close to the fire, and underneath all of it the faint sourness of a root cellar that hasn't seen fresh vegetables in 4 months. This is not a metaphor. This is Tuesday morning. Most people in 1843 America lived within a few miles of where they were born, and most of them would die there too. The average American had never seen the ocean, had never ridden a train, had never read a newspaper printed more recently than a week ago, because that's how long it took news to travel by horse and coach from the nearest city. If you got sick 200 miles from a doctor, there was no doctor. There was a neighbour with a jar of herbs and a prayer. What's remarkable is that despite all of this, the isolation, the danger, the sheer physical grind of staying alive, these were not people who saw themselves as suffering. They saw themselves as simply living. This was just what life required. Sarah's husband, Thomas, is already out in the field by the time the sun cracks the horizon. He's been awake since before 4 as well, tending to 2 mules that are, quite literally, the most valuable possessions the family owns, worth more than the cabin itself. If one of those mules goes lame this spring, the family doesn't just lose convenience, they lose the plough, they lose the planting season, they potentially lose the year. There is no insurance. There is no bank loan waiting to bail them out. there is only the next harvest, and the one after that, stacked up like a row of dominoes that could all fall down from a single sick animal or a single bad storm. Let's talk numbers for a second, because the numbers are almost impossible to believe from where we're sitting now. In 1840, the average American woman gave birth to just over 7 children in her lifetime. Of those 7, historians estimate that roughly 2 would not live to see their 5th birthday. Read that again. Not 2 out of 7 who faced hardship. 2 out of 7 who simply did not survive. This wasn't considered a national emergency. There was no headline. It was woven so completely into daily life that families sometimes didn't even name a child until it survived the first dangerous year. And this is where the story gets its edge, the part most people watching this don't expect. Despite the death, despite the grinding physical labour, despite living in a world with no antibiotics, no refrigeration, and no reliable way to know if the water you were drinking would kill you. The 1840s were also one of the most hopeful decades in American history. This was the era of westward expansion, of the Oregon Trail opening up, of new inventions arriving one after another, each one promising to make life just a little less brutal than it had been for their parents. Sarah and Thomas believed, with total sincerity, that their children would have it easier than they did. They had no way of knowing that a war was coming in less than 20 years that would tear the entire country apart. They had no way of knowing what would happen to families just like theirs, scattered across a nation that hadn't yet decided what it actually was. So here's the question I want you sitting with as we go deeper into this world together. If you woke up tomorrow morning in 1843, no phone, no doctor, no guarantee that your children would survive the winter, would you have the strength that Sarah had? Would you get out of bed at 4 a.m. and start the fire anyway? Or do you think, quietly, that our comfort has cost us something we don't like to talk about? Stay with me, because in the next part of this story we're going to step fully into that world, the sounds, the smells, the textures of a single day in 1843. And by the end of it, I don't think you'll ever look at a light switch the same way again. Close your eyes for just a second, because I want you to hear this before you see it. It's a sound almost nobody alive today has ever actually heard in real life. Not in a movie, not in a museum exhibit behind glass. The sound of a whole house going quiet at 9 p.m, not because anyone said so, but because there was nothing left to do once the light was gone. No hum of a refrigerator, no electrical buzz behind the walls, just wind, just the settle of log timbers cooling after a long day of sun. Just, somewhere far off, a dog barking at something only it can sense in the dark. This is 1843, and you are standing right in the middle of it. The air smells different here, heavier somehow, and more alive. Wood smoke clings to everything, your hair, your clothes, the inside of your nose until you stop noticing it at all. Underneath that there's the sharp animal smell of the barn drifting in whenever the wind shifts, mixed with drying herbs hanging from the rafters. Sage, yarrow, feverfew, tied in little bundles, hanging upside down like something out of an old folk tale. Tallow candles burn with a smell you'd probably find unpleasant if you weren't used to it. A little like burnt fat, because that's exactly what it is. Beeswax candles smell sweeter, cleaner, but they cost real money, so those are saved for special nights only. Feel the floor beneath your feet. It's not smooth, it's rough-hewn wood, uneven in places, cold enough in January that nobody walks across it barefoot if they can help it. Most families keep a rag rug near the hearth, woven by hand from scraps of old clothing that had already lived 3 other lives before becoming something to stand on. The walls are close. A typical family cabin in this era might be 16 feet by 20 feet total. That's the whole house. 1 room, sometimes 2, holding a family of 6 or 7 people along with everything they own. There's no separate bedroom for the children. There's no privacy in the way we understand it now. Beds are often shared, 2 or 3 to a straw-stuffed mattress, with quilts layered heavy enough to keep out a cold that seeps in through every gap in the log walls. Now listen again, because the sounds change with the hour. In the morning it's the creak of the well rope and the splash of a bucket hitting water below. It's the scrape of a cast iron pan against the hearthstone. It's a rooster, somewhere close, absolutely convinced that 4:30 is an acceptable time to start shouting about it. By midday it's different. It's the rhythmic chop of an axe against wood that never seems to run out of jobs to be done. It's children's voices, but not the way we hear children's voices now. These are working voices. A 6-year-old in 1843 isn't at school for 6 hours a day. She's carrying water. She's minding a younger sibling. She's learning to sew a straight seam because a crooked one wastes fabric nobody can afford to waste. What strikes me most about this era is how early childhood simply ended. There was no real concept of adolescence the way we know it today. You were a small child and then, almost overnight, you were a small adult with real responsibilities and real consequences if you failed at them. A 12-year-old boy in rural Indiana might already know how to handle a plow team, mend a fence and shoot a rifle well enough to bring home dinner if the crops came up short. Not because anyone thought this was remarkable, because the alternative was going hungry. Let's step outside for a moment, because the world beyond the cabin door tells its own story. The road, if you can call it that, is really just packed dirt, rutted deep from wagon wheels and turned to thick, sucking mud whenever it rains. In spring, that mud can swallow a wagon wheel up to the axle, and getting unstuck might cost you half a day and every ounce of patience you have left. There are no streetlights. There is no glow on the horizon from a nearby town, the way you'd see today from almost anywhere in the country. At night, the darkness is complete, in a way that's almost hard to describe if you've never experienced it. Total darkness. The kind where you genuinely cannot see your own hand in front of your face. And above all of that darkness, the stars. More stars than most of us will ever see in our entire lives, because there's no artificial light anywhere for miles to compete with them. Sarah, the woman we met at the start of this story, spends her days moving through a rhythm so demanding it's almost hard to comprehend now. Washing clothes isn't a matter of pressing a button. It's hauling water, heating it over the fire, scrubbing fabric against a washboard until her knuckles bleed, then wringing it out by hand and hanging it to dry, weather depending. This process alone can eat an entire day, once a week, without fail. Cooking isn't a matter of opening a package. It's tending a fire that has to stay at just the right temperature, using a heavy iron pot that weighs more than some of her children, preparing food that was likely grown, harvested, and preserved by her own hands months earlier. There is no such thing as a quick meal. There is no such thing as a day off. And yet, here's the part that might surprise you. Despite everything I've just described, families like Sarah's found real, unmistakable joy in this life. Evenings, when the work was finally done, often ended with music. A fiddle, if the family was lucky enough to own one. Voices raised together in old hymns or ballads, carried over from grandparents who'd carried them over from their own grandparents. Community mattered here in a way that's almost foreign to how many of us live now. When a neighbour's barn needed raising, the whole area showed up, because everyone understood, without needing to be told, that next month it might be their own barn that needed the same help. This was a world built entirely on interdependence. No one survived 1843 completely alone. Not really. You needed your neighbours for the harvest. You needed the local midwife when your children were born. You needed the blacksmith to shoe your horse, and the peddler who came through twice a year carrying news, along with needles, thread, and the occasional small luxury like store-bought sugar or a bolt of new calico fabric. Every relationship had weight to it because every relationship had consequence. A falling out with a neighbour wasn't just uncomfortable. It could mean the difference between surviving a hard winter and not. As the sun starts to set on this particular day in 1843, Sarah lights a single candle because that's all the light the evening requires. Thomas comes in from the field, exhausted in a way that goes bone deep, the kind of tired that modern desk work simply doesn't produce anymore. The children gather close to the hearth, not because it's cosy, though it is, but because it's the only warm place in the entire house. And for a few hours before the candle burns down and the fire is banked for the night, this family exists in a small pocket of quiet, together, in a world that offers almost no guarantees beyond this exact moment. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, its own dangers, its own small, hard-won victories. But for now, in the flickering light of a single candle, they have exactly this. And in 1843 America, that was never something anyone took for granted. Most people believe 1840s America was a simple, God-fearing, buttoned-up world where everyone worked hard, went to church, and lived some kind of clean, moral, black and white existence. That version shows up in paintings, in old textbooks, in the kind of nostalgic imagery that gets used to sell you everything from furniture to political slogans. But the truth is a lot messier than that, and a lot more human. Here's the first thing that surprises people. This was one of the most heavily intoxicated periods in American history. By the early 1830s, before the temperance movement really took hold, the average American adult was drinking something like 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. Not beer, not wine, pure alcohol, mostly in the form of whiskey and hard cider. That's roughly 3 times what the average American drinks today. Whiskey wasn't a treat, it was a staple. Farmhands were sometimes paid partly in liquor. Children drank watered-down cider with breakfast, because in a world where clean water wasn't guaranteed, a mildly alcoholic drink was often considered safer than what came out of the well. By the 1840s, a massive backlash was already underway. Temperance societies were spreading fast, and drinking had become one of the most bitterly contested moral issues in the entire country. Preachers thundered about it from pulpits. Wives organised against it in kitchens and church basements. It divided families the way political arguments do at dinner tables today. So that image of the sober, upright 1840s household, it's only half the story, and usually the half that came after a very messy, very complicated fight. Here's the second myth. People assume everyone in this era was deeply, devoutly religious, attending the same tidy little white church every single Sunday without question. The reality is far stranger and far more interesting. This was the era of the Second Great Awakening, a period of religious revival so intense it sometimes bordered on outright chaos. Massive outdoor gatherings called camp meetings would draw thousands of people from miles around, lasting for days at a time. Eyewitness accounts describe people falling to the ground in fits, shaking uncontrollably, crying out, even barking like animals in what was known quite literally as the jerks. These weren't fringe cults on the edge of society. These were mainstream religious experiences drawing entire communities. Out of this same explosive religious energy came entirely new American faiths. The Mormon movement, founded by Joseph Smith, was expanding rapidly through this decade. The Millerites, followers of a preacher named William Miller, became utterly convinced the world would end in 1844, selling off farms and possessions in preparation. When the date came and went, historians still refer to it today as the Great Disappointment. This wasn't a calm, settled religious landscape. It was a spiritual wildfire, and it was reshaping the country in real time. Here's a myth that hits even closer to home. People imagine 1840s marriage as some kind of stable, unshakable institution where couples simply endured whatever came their way, no matter how difficult. In reality, this was a period bracing for enormous upheaval. Death didn't just claim children, it claimed spouses constantly, and remarriage happened fast, often within months, out of sheer practical necessity. A widower with 5 children on a working farm simply could not function alone. A widow with no income had almost no way to survive without remarrying quickly. What's remarkable is that a woman in her 30s might already be on her 2nd or even 3rd marriage, not from choice or scandal, but from a brutal string of loss that today we'd consider almost unthinkable to survive even once. Now, let's talk about something that gets almost entirely erased from the postcard version of this era: race and slavery. By the 1840s, slavery wasn't some distant background issue. It was the single most explosive, defining conflict in American life, and it touched nearly everything, from politics to religion to everyday economics. In the South, roughly 1 in 3 people was enslaved. In states like Mississippi and South Carolina, enslaved people actually outnumbered free white residents. This was not a minor feature of Southern life. It was the entire foundation of the Southern economy, built on the forced, unpaid labour of millions of human beings. The domestic slave trade during this decade was staggering in its brutality. Historians estimate that roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1820 and 1860, largely to feed the exploding cotton economy. Families were torn apart routinely, sold off from one another with no legal protection whatsoever, no court to appeal to, no rights recognised by any government. Meanwhile, in the North, abolitionist movements were gaining real momentum. Frederick Douglass, having escaped slavery just a few years earlier, was becoming one of the most powerful public speakers in the entire country. The Underground Railroad was actively moving people toward freedom, often through genuinely dangerous, life-threatening routes. This wasn't a peaceful, settled decade quietly leading up to some distant future conflict. It was a country already at war with itself, decades before a single shot was fired at Fort Sumter. Here's another assumption worth breaking apart. People picture the American frontier as this romantic, wide-open, mostly empty land, simply waiting for settlers to arrive. The truth is far more complicated and far more tragic. This land wasn't empty. It was home to hundreds of indigenous nations, each with their own governments, languages, and long-established histories. The 1830s had already brought the Indian Removal Act and the horror of the Trail of Tears, forcing tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people from their homelands. Historians estimate that thousands died along the way, from exposure, disease, and outright starvation. By the 1840s, westward expansion was accelerating fast, driven by a belief that would soon be given an actual name: manifest destiny. The idea that America was somehow divinely entitled to expand from coast to coast. For American settlers like Sarah and Thomas, this often felt like opportunity, like hope, like a fresh start. For the indigenous nations already living on that land, it felt like something else entirely, an invasion, dressed up in the language of progress. So when people picture 1840s America as some kind of simple, wholesome era, they're really only picturing one very narrow slice of it. The version that got preserved in old paintings and nostalgic memory. The real decade was loud. It was messy. It was full of contradiction, spiritual chaos, addiction, expansion, and a slavery system tearing the moral fabric of the country apart in ways that were already becoming impossible to ignore. Most people don't realize that the very same decade producing quiet log cabins and quilting circles was also producing some of the deepest moral fractures in all of American history. And those fractures didn't heal in the 1840s. They only got deeper. Because in less than 20 years, this same country, built on all of this contradiction, would tear itself apart in a war more devastating than anything its people could have possibly imagined while sitting quietly by their hearths at night. Her name was Narcissa Whitman, and in the spring of 1836 she did something almost no American woman had ever done before. She crossed the Rocky Mountains, not by railroad because there was no railroad, not by any real road at all most days, by wagon, on horseback, and eventually on foot, across nearly 2,000 miles of country that most people back east could barely imagine. Narcissa was 27 years old when she made that journey, newly married to a doctor and missionary named Marcus Whitman. She'd grown up in western New York, in a devout Presbyterian household, the kind of place where duty and faith were woven into everything, including the biggest decisions of a person's life. She had pale skin, light hair, and by most accounts, a striking, almost luminous presence, the kind of face people remembered long after meeting her. But what made Narcissa remarkable wasn't how she looked. It was what she chose to do with the years she had left. She and Marcus set out west with the explicit goal of establishing a mission among the Cayuse people, near what's now Walla Walla, in present-day Washington state. Picture, for a moment, what that decision actually meant in 1836. This wasn't a short trip with a return date circled on a calendar. Once Narcissa left New York, she understood, with total clarity, that she would likely never see her family again. No letters arrived quickly. No visits were possible. A journey that took months each way meant that leaving home was, in every practical sense, permanent. She kept a diary throughout the crossing, and that diary still exists today, giving us something rare. A woman's own voice describing this exact moment in American history in her own words as it happened to her. She wrote about waking before dawn to the sound of oxen being yoked, about dust so thick on the trail that it coated everything, her clothes, her food, the inside of her mouth by midday, about river crossings so dangerous that wagons sometimes tipped, spilling entire families' possessions into the current, gone in seconds. She wrote about exhaustion that went deeper than anything she'd known before, about blistered feet, about the strange, overwhelming beauty of mountains she'd only ever read about, rising up ahead of her like something out of scripture. And she wrote, quietly, about fear. Fear of the unknown people she'd meet. Fear of what her new life would actually require of her. Fear, sometimes, that she'd made a terrible mistake. When Narcissa and Marcus finally reached Cayuse territory and established their mission, they built a life there that, on the surface, looked almost ordinary. A house, a garden, a small growing community around them. But underneath that ordinary surface, deep and complicated tension was building year after year, and Narcissa was right at the centre of it. The Whitmans had come west believing, with total sincerity, that they were bringing something good. Faith, medicine, a different way of living that they believed in the framework of their time was an improvement over what already existed. The Cayuse people saw it differently, and understandably so. This was their land, their culture, their entire way of life, and it was being quietly, steadily reshaped by outsiders who hadn't asked permission to change it. What's remarkable about Narcissa's diary is how much of this tension she actually recorded herself, sometimes without fully understanding its weight. She wrote about Cayuse families who came to her for medicine, and about the ones who grew increasingly wary of her husband's presence. She wrote about her own daughter, Alice Clarissa, the first child of European descent born west of the Rocky Mountains, and about the joy that small life brought into the mission. And she wrote, only 2 years later, about losing that same daughter, drowned in a nearby river at just 2 years old. This is the part of the human cost that rarely makes it into the grand story of westward expansion. Behind every wagon train, every new settlement, every line on a map redrawn further west, there were mothers like Narcissa, burying children in unfamiliar ground, thousands of miles from anyone who'd known them as children themselves. By the mid-1840s, the tension around the Whitman mission had grown into something far more dangerous. Wagon trains moving west along what would become known as the Oregon Trail were bringing more than just settlers. They were bringing disease. In 1847, a measles epidemic swept through the Cayuse community near the mission, killing a devastating number of Cayuse people, while the white settlers around them, who had some existing immunity, largely survived. To the Cayuse, watching their own children die while white children lived, this wasn't simply tragic. It looked, understandably, like something far more sinister. In November of that same year, a group of Cayuse men, believing Marcus Whitman was deliberately poisoning their people rather than treating them, attacked the mission. Narcissa Whitman was killed that day, along with her husband and 11 others. She was 39 years old. Her death became one of the most widely reported events on the entire frontier, sparking outrage back east and eventually leading to a war between American settlers and the Cayuse Nation, one that would end, years later, with land taken, treaties broken, and a people forever changed by a conflict they hadn't started. I'm telling you Narcissa's story not because it's simple, but because it's exactly the opposite. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't purely a victim either. She was a real woman, driven by genuine conviction, who made an extraordinarily difficult choice to leave everything she knew, and who ended up, without ever fully realizing it, standing directly in the middle of one of the most painful collisions in all of American history. Her diary still survives in archives today. The actual paper she wrote on, the actual ink from her own hand. When historians read it now, they're not reading a textbook summary. They're reading the private thoughts of a woman living through history before she had any idea it would become history at all. What strikes me most about Narcissa's story is this. She believed, right up until her final years, that she was living a life of purpose and hope. She had no way of knowing how her story would end, no way of knowing that the same conviction that carried her across 2,000 miles of unmapped country would eventually place her at the centre of a tragedy that would echo for generations. That's the thing about living inside history instead of reading about it afterward. You never get to see the ending coming. As we move forward in this story, I want you to hold on to something. Narcissa Whitman crossed those mountains believing she was moving towards something better. And in a strange, complicated way, millions of ordinary Americans in this exact decade believe the exact same thing about their own lives, even as the ground beneath the entire country was quietly shifting towards something none of them could have predicted. The next part of this story is going to show you exactly how deep that shift really went, and just how differently this same decade looked, depending entirely on which side of it you happen to be standing on. Here's something almost nobody considers when they picture 1840s America. The exact same decade, the exact same year even, looked like two completely different worlds depending entirely on where you were standing. While Sarah was raising her children in an Ohio cabin, and Narcissa was crossing the Rockies toward Oregon, there was a third America existing at the very same moment. One that almost never makes it into the popular picture of this era at all. Picture a Cayuse elder, standing on a ridge overlooking the Whitman mission, watching wagon after wagon roll in from the east. From where Sarah stood, this was expansion, opportunity, the natural, almost inevitable spread of a growing nation. From where that elder stood, It was something closer to a slow-motion invasion. Watching his own children's world shrink, piece by piece, year after year, at the hands of people who genuinely believed they were doing something good. Neither person was lying about what they saw. They were simply standing on opposite sides of the exact same event. Now shift again, further south this time, to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. Here, in this same decade, a woman named Harriet, an enslaved mother of 4, wakes before dawn just like Sarah does. She lights no candle of her own choosing, tends no fire for her own family's comfort first. Her labour from sun-up to sundown belongs by law to someone else entirely. Her children are legally property, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Under the actual laws of the United States in 1843, a person could be born, live, and die as another person's legal possession, with no more rights than a plough horse or a wagon wheel. If Harriet's owner decided to sell one of her children to a plantation 200 miles away, there was no court, no law, no appeal that could stop it. It simply happened, and it happened often, tearing apart tens of thousands of families across the South throughout this exact decade. This is the part of the story that the postcard version of the 1840s conveniently leaves out. The quiet cabin, the quilting circle, the fiddle music by the hearth. All of that was real. But it existed at the exact same moment as auction blocks in Charleston and New Orleans, where human beings stood while strangers inspected their teeth and their hands like livestock. Most people don't realize just how directly connected these two worlds actually were. The cotton that clothed Sarah's family, the sugar that sweetened her tea, the raw materials feeding entire northern textile mills, much of it traced directly back to forced unpaid labour happening just a few states away. This wasn't two separate Americas existing side by coincidence. It was one single economy, built on two radically different human experiences, tangled together in ways most people at the time chose simply not to examine too closely. Now let's shift perspective one more time, because there's a fourth America worth seeing clearly here too. In cities like Boston, New York and Philadelphia, an entirely different kind of 1840s was unfolding. Factory smoke instead of wood smoke. Immigrant labourers, many arriving from Ireland and Germany in growing numbers, crowding into tenement housing that was often just as harsh, in its own way, as anything happening out on the frontier. A textile worker in Lowell, Massachusetts might spend 12, sometimes 13 hours a day standing at a loom, breathing cotton dust that would slowly damage her lungs over years of exposure. Many of these workers were young women, some barely into their teens, sending wages home to families who depended entirely on that income to survive. This was industrial America, arriving early and arriving fast, and it looked almost nothing like the log cabin version of the decade that tends to dominate our collective memory. Here's where the perspective shift gets genuinely uncomfortable, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment. Every single person in these different Americas, Sarah on her farm, Narcissa on the frontier, Harriet on the plantation, a factory girl in Lowell, believed, in their own way, that they understood what their country actually was. Sarah believed in hard work and quiet faith. Narcissa believed in bringing a better way of life to people who hadn't asked for it. Harriet understood, with a clarity none of the others could fully grasp, exactly what freedom actually meant, because she was the one person among them who didn't have it. And the factory girl in Lowell was discovering something entirely new, that even freedom on paper didn't guarantee safety, fair treatment, or real control over your own life. What makes this decade so genuinely fascinating rather than simply sad or simple is that all four of these Americas were colliding constantly, whether people realized it consciously or not. The abolitionist movement was growing directly out of the tension between Sarah's world and Harriet's. Frederick Douglass, delivering searing public speeches throughout the North during this exact decade, was forcing white Americans who'd never once questioned slavery to finally, uncomfortably look directly at it. Meanwhile, labour organising was beginning to stir in places like Lowell, as workers slowly realised that collective action might be the only real tool they had against factory owners who held nearly all the power. And out on the frontier, the seeds of a war that would reshape the entire Pacific Northwest were already quietly taking root, years before that war actually began. This is what I mean when I say nothing in history is simply black and white. The 1840s weren't one story. They were at least four running simultaneously, each one completely convinced it represented the true version of America. And here's the genuinely uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. Every single one of those four Americas was right, at least about their own experience. That's exactly what made the coming decades so violently unavoidable. You cannot hold four such radically different realities inside one single country forever without something, eventually, being forced to give way. By the time we reach the 1850s and 60s, this exact tension, quietly building throughout the decade we're exploring right now, is going to erupt into the most devastating conflict in all of American history. But right now, in 1843, none of these four people know that yet. Sarah is simply trying to get through the winter. Narcissa is simply trying to build a life she believes in. Harriet is simply trying to keep her children close for one more day. And that factory girl in Lowell is simply trying to send enough money home to help her family survive. They're all living inside the same decade, breathing the same air, completely unaware of just how much their futures are already quietly entangled with one another. And that, more than any date or any battle, is the real story of what everyday life was actually like in 1840s America. Not one simple existence, but four entirely different ones, colliding in silence, slowly building towards something none of them could yet see coming. By 1844, something was shifting. Quietly at first, then not so quietly at all. The wagon trains heading west weren't just growing larger, they were multiplying. What had been a trickle of a few hundred settlers each year along the Oregon Trail was becoming a flood. Thousands upon thousands, all moving in the same direction, all chasing the same promise. And with that many people moving that fast into land that wasn't empty, something was bound to break. Back in Ohio, Sarah and Thomas were hearing rumours now. Travellers passing through, peddlers with news from the east, whispered stories of families packing up entire farms, selling off everything they owned, and setting out for a place called Oregon country that most of them had never actually seen with their own eyes. The rumours promised land, free land. More than most families back east could ever hope to own. But the rumours left out the cost. They left out the graves. Historians estimate that along the roughly 2,000-mile length of the Oregon Trail, somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 17 travellers died before reaching their destination. Cholera, accidental gunshot wounds, drowning at river crossings, wagon accidents that crushed limbs in an instant, with no doctor for hundreds of miles in any direction. Entire families sometimes buried a child in the morning and were back on the trail again by afternoon, because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind in certain seasons meant getting caught in mountain snow that could kill everyone. This wasn't a romantic journey toward a fresh start. It was a gamble, played with human lives, and the odds weren't nearly as generous as the rumour suggested. Meanwhile, in Washington, a political fight was heating up fast, one that would directly shape the fate of everyone moving west. The question of Oregon's exact boundary with British-controlled territory had been simmering for years, but by 1844 it exploded into a full-blown national argument. Some politicians were pushing hard for the entire Pacific Northwest. all the way up to a boundary line at 54 degrees 40 minutes latitude, a slogan started spreading through newspapers and political rallies alike. 5440 or fight. It sounded almost like a battle cry, and for a tense stretch of months, war with Britain over this exact stretch of land felt like a real, genuine possibility. Ordinary Americans like Sarah and Thomas, sitting in their Ohio cabin hundreds of miles from any ocean, suddenly found themselves following political news with real anxiety, because a war over Oregon could mean a war that reached into their own lives, pulling sons and husbands into a conflict none of them had asked for. At the same moment, an entirely different kind of tension was escalating down south. Texas, which had won independence from Mexico back in 1836, was pushing hard for annexation into the United States. But this wasn't a simple, uncontested decision. Adding Texas meant adding a massive new slave state, and that single fact was already threatening to tear apart the fragile political balance holding the entire country together. Northern abolitionists saw annexation as a naked power grab, an attempt to expand the reach of slavery deep into new territory. Southern slaveholders saw it as an economic necessity, a matter of survival for a system they depended on completely. By 1844, this argument wasn't confined to Congress anymore. It was showing up in church sermons, in newspaper editorials, in heated arguments breaking out at general stores and town meetings across the entire country. Here's where things get shorter, sharper, because that's exactly how this moment felt to the people living through it. Congress debated, newspapers screamed, Southern planters demanded action, Northern abolitionists demanded restraint. Meanwhile, out on the frontier, tensions with indigenous nations were escalating fast, as more and more settlers pushed further into land that had never been ceded, never been sold, never been surrendered by the people who'd lived there for generations. Near the Whitman mission, Cayuse leaders were watching the flood of wagon trains with growing alarm. Each new arrival meant less land, fewer resources, a world shrinking around them faster than they could possibly adapt to. Something was building. Everyone could feel it, even if almost nobody could name it clearly yet. Back in that Ohio cabin, Sarah felt none of this directly, not at first. Her days were still filled with the same relentless rhythm. Water, fire, food, children. But even she was starting to notice small changes creeping into her world. Prices at the general store were shifting. Talk at church on Sunday mornings had turned sharper, more political, less about scripture, and more about Texas, about Oregon, about what kind of country America was actually going to become. Thomas came home from a trip into town one evening looking more shaken than she'd seen him in years. A neighbour, someone he'd known for over a decade, had nearly come to blows with another man over the question of Texas annexation, right there on the street in broad daylight. This is the moment when people realise this was bigger than they'd thought. Not a distant political argument happening in far-off Washington, a fault line running directly through their own communities, their own churches, sometimes even their own families. By late 1844, James K. Polk had won the presidency, running on an aggressive platform of expansion, promising to secure both Oregon and Texas for the United States, no matter the cost. His victory didn't calm the tension, it intensified it. Suddenly, everything Sarah had been hearing as distant rumour was becoming official government policy, moving fast with real consequences already beginning to take shape. Texas would be formally annexed within the year. War with Mexico, though almost nobody could see it clearly yet, was now less than 18 months away. And the Oregon boundary dispute, while eventually resolved through negotiation rather than war, had already revealed just how close the country had come to a conflict most Americans genuinely hadn't wanted. What's remarkable is how quickly ordinary daily life and enormous historical consequence were becoming impossible to separate from one another. Sarah wasn't reading history. She was living directly inside it. One uneasy Sunday sermon at a time, one tense conversation at the general store at a time, without any way of knowing exactly where all of this pressure was actually heading. The wagon trains kept rolling west. The political arguments kept escalating in Washington, and underneath all of it, the machinery of a much larger, much more devastating conflict was already quietly, steadily assembling itself piece by piece, completely out of sight of the people whose lives it would eventually consume. In the next part of this story, we're going to pull back the curtain on exactly what that machinery actually was, who was really pulling the levers behind all of this expansion, all of this tension, and just how much ordinary Americans like Sarah and Thomas actually understood about the forces quietly reshaping their entire world. Here's a question worth asking directly. Who actually benefited from all of this expansion? Not the families riding in those wagons toward Oregon, not the farmers like Sarah and Thomas tending their small plots of land back in Ohio. Somebody else entirely was driving this machine, and most ordinary Americans never fully saw the hands on the controls. Let's start with land speculation, because this is where the real hidden economics of the 1840s actually lived. Long before a single settler family reached Oregon or Texas, wealthy investors back east, along with government-connected land companies, were already buying up massive tracts of territory at rock-bottom prices, anticipating exactly what was coming. These weren't farmers. Many of these men never set foot west of the Mississippi River in their entire lives. They were businessmen in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, reading the same newspapers as Sarah's family, but reading them for a completely different purpose. Not for news, for opportunity. Once settlers began pouring into a territory, land values climbed fast, sometimes doubling or tripling within just a few years. The speculators who'd bought early sold late, at enormous profit, while the families who'd actually done the backbreaking work of clearing that land, building homes on it, and burying children in it often saw none of that windfall at all. Now let's look at cotton, because cotton is where the hidden machinery of this entire decade becomes impossible to ignore. By the 1840s, cotton wasn't just a southern crop. It was, in very real terms, the engine driving the entire American economy, and increasingly, the global economy as well. Northern textile mills, the same ones employing young women in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, depended entirely on a steady, cheap supply of raw cotton grown in the South. British textile factories, some of the largest and most profitable businesses in the entire world at that time, depended on it too. This created something historians now sometimes call the Cotton Kingdom, an economic system so deeply intertwined that northern bankers, northern shipping companies, and northern insurance firms were all making enormous profits directly tied to a system of slave labour, even while many of those same northern states had already outlawed slavery within their own borders. What ordinary people rarely saw, and what many actively avoided looking at too closely, was just how connected their own comfortable lives really were to a system built on forced human suffering, happening just a few states away. So who actually knew the full picture here, and who didn't? In Washington, politicians and plantation owners understood this economic machine with total, unflinching clarity. Southern congressmen fought fiercely to protect and expand slavery, not out of some abstract ideology alone, but because their entire regional economy and their personal fortunes depended on it directly. Northern industrialists, meanwhile, often quietly benefited from this same system while publicly distancing themselves from it. sometimes even funding abolitionist causes with one hand while profiting from cotton-driven textile mills with the other. Ordinary families like Sarah's, out in Ohio, understood almost none of this larger machinery. They knew cotton clothing was affordable. They knew certain goods cost less than they used to. They rarely, if ever, traced that affordability back to its actual human source. Now let's turn to westward expansion itself, because there's a hidden political motive here too, one that goes well beyond simple curiosity about new land. Southern politicians pushed aggressively for new territories like Texas, specifically because more territory meant more potential slave states, which meant more political power in Congress, which meant a better chance of protecting slavery permanently against a growing northern population that increasingly opposed it. Northern politicians, meanwhile, often pushed for territories like Oregon specifically to counterbalance that exact strategy, hoping new free states would keep the political scales from tipping too far in the South's favour. This wasn't really about land at all, not fundamentally. It was about power, about which vision of America, one built on free labour or one built on slavery, would ultimately control the country's future. Ordinary settlers heading west in their wagons were, in many cases, unknowingly serving as pieces on a much larger political chessboard, one being played by men who would never personally risk a single mile of that dangerous journey themselves. There's another hidden layer here too, one connected directly to Narcissa Whitman's story from earlier. Missionary expansion into places like Oregon country wasn't purely a matter of individual religious conviction. It was actively encouraged and often quietly financed by American political interests eager to establish a stronger claim to that territory before Britain could solidify its own. Missionaries like Narcissa and Marcus Whitman genuinely believed in their spiritual purpose, but their presence also served a second, more practical function, whether they fully recognized it or not. Every mission established, every American family settled on that land, strengthened the United States' eventual claim to the entire Pacific Northwest. This is the uncomfortable complexity sitting underneath so much of this decade. Individual sincerity and larger political strategy were often tangled together so tightly that even the people living through it couldn't always tell where one ended and the other began. Meanwhile, in the industrial cities of the North, factory owners were building their own hidden machine, one running on an entirely different kind of exploitation. Young immigrant and rural women drawn to cities like Lowell with promises of independence and fair wages often found themselves working under conditions that offered neither. 12, sometimes 13-hour days, wages that could be, and often were, cut without warning or explanation. Living conditions in company-owned boarding houses that gave employers enormous, almost unchecked control over workers' entire lives, both on and off the factory floor. The owners of these mills understood something clearly that their workers often didn't fully grasp until much later. A steady, controllable, cheap labour force, whether enslaved in the South or vulnerable in the North, was the single most valuable asset driving American economic growth throughout this entire decade. So when we ask who really knew what was happening beneath the surface of 1840s America, the honest answer is uncomfortable. Power was concentrated in remarkably few hands, and those hands understood the machinery with far more clarity than the millions of ordinary people whose daily lives it directly controlled. Sarah didn't know about land speculation driving up prices on frontier property. Harriet, enslaved on that Mississippi plantation, understood the brutal mechanics of the cotton economy with a clarity none of the others could match, because she was the one paying its actual cost with her own body and her own family. The factory girl in Lowell was only beginning to recognize the mechanisms controlling her wages and her freedom. Most people don't realize just how deliberately this information gap was maintained. Newspapers controlled by wealthy interests. political speeches designed to obscure rather than clarify. An economic system so complex and so geographically spread out that connecting cause to effect required a kind of awareness that very few ordinary Americans had the tools, the time, or the access to develop. This is the machinery running underneath everything we've explored so far. Not some vague, abstract force called history moving people around like pieces on a board. Real people, real decisions, real profits, flowing upward into a relatively small number of hands, while the actual human cost, the blistered feet on the Oregon Trail, the auction blocks in Mississippi, the coughing lungs in a Lowell textile mill, landed squarely on people who had almost no power to change the system controlling their lives. And this exact imbalance, quietly building and compounding throughout the 1840s, was about to be tested in the most direct, most personal way imaginable. Because when survival stopped being an abstract concept and became an immediate physical reality, ordinary people were forced to make choices that would reveal exactly what they were made of. That's where we're headed next. Into the moments when comfort disappeared completely, and all that was left was the raw human choice between giving up and holding on. Winter in Ohio, 1845, arrived early and stayed hard. By late November, snow had already buried the fence lines around Sarah and Thomas's farm, and the well rope had frozen solid more mornings than either of them could count. This wasn't an unusual winter by the standards of the time. It was simply another test, one of dozens this family had already faced and would face again. But this particular winter, something went wrong that no amount of hard work could fix. Thomas fell ill in early December. It started as a cough, the kind that seemed ordinary enough at first, the kind every family expected once the cold weather settled in. But within a week, the cough had deepened into something else entirely, something that left him struggling for breath, burning with fever, unable to rise from the bed most mornings. There was no doctor within a day's ride. There was no medicine beyond what Sarah could prepare herself, drawing on knowledge passed down from her own mother. Willow bark tea for the fever, onion poultices for the chest, prayer offered quietly and repeatedly for everything else. For nearly 3 weeks, Sarah ran the entire farm alone, while also nursing a dying husband and caring for 5 children, the youngest barely past infancy. Picture what that actually required. Before dawn, she was breaking ice on the water trough for the 2 mules, because if they died too, the family would lose everything come spring planting. She was splitting what firewood she could manage alone, though never quite as much as Thomas would have split. She was cooking, cleaning, mending, all while checking on her husband every hour, terrified each time that this check might be the one where he'd stopped breathing entirely. Her eldest daughter, only 9 years old at the time, took on responsibilities that would seem almost unimaginable for a child today, minding her younger siblings for hours at a stretch, learning to help with basic cooking over an open hearth, a task that came with very real danger of serious burns. This is what survival actually looked like in 1840s America. Not a dramatic single moment of crisis, but weeks upon weeks of grinding, exhausting endurance, with no guarantee at all of how the story would end. Thomas survived that winter, though barely, and it took him months afterward to regain anything close to his former strength. Sarah never spoke much about those 3 weeks in later years, according to family letters that survived her. But those who knew her said something in her had changed permanently, a kind of quiet, unshakable toughness that hadn't been there quite the same way before. This is the human cost so easily lost in broader historical accounts. Illness wasn't just a personal tragedy in this era. It was a full-scale emergency capable of unravelling an entire family's future in a matter of weeks, with almost no safety net available to catch them if they fell. Now let's return to Harriet, the enslaved mother we met earlier, because her survival story reveals a form of resistance entirely different from anything Sarah ever had to consider. In the mid-1840s, word reached the plantation where Harriet lived and worked that a nearby family, enslaved on a neighbouring property, had attempted an escape north, guided by a series of secret contacts that history would eventually come to know as the Underground Railroad. Harriet had heard whispered stories like this before, carried carefully from one plantation to another, passed along in coded language disguised within songs sung during field work, phrases that sounded to any listener who wasn't meant to understand them like nothing more than ordinary spirituals. Songs like Wade in the Water carried real, practical instructions hidden within their lyrics, guidance about avoiding tracking dogs by travelling through streams and rivers. This wasn't simply music offering comfort. It was an entire covert survival network, built and maintained under constant threat of violence, hidden in plain sight from those who held power over these people's lives. Harriet never made an escape attempt herself. The risk to her children was simply too severe, and she said as much, according to accounts recorded decades later during interviews conducted with formerly enslaved people. But she found other, quieter ways to resist within the brutal confines of her situation. She taught her children to read in secret, using scraps of paper and stolen moments. Despite the fact that teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in most southern states throughout this exact decade, she preserved stories, traditions and songs passed down from her own parents, refusing to let an entire cultural inheritance be erased by a system designed specifically to erase it. This was resistance too, quieter than an escape attempt but no less courageous. Holding on to identity, onto humanity, onto hope for a future her children might someday actually reach, even when she herself might never live to see it. Now let's shift, one final time, to the Oregon Trail itself, because survival there took on its own distinct and brutal shape. A woman named Amelia Stewart Knight, travelling west with her family in 1853, kept a diary remarkably similar in spirit to Narcissa Whitman's. In it, she recorded giving birth to a child on the trail itself, during an active, ongoing journey, with almost no rest afforded either before or after the delivery. She wrote about continuing the journey again within days, because stopping simply wasn't an option. The mountains ahead demanded to be crossed before winter snow made the passage completely impassable, and a newborn child changed absolutely nothing about that unforgiving timeline. Accounts like hers reveal something remarkable about the sheer physical resilience demanded of women during this entire era. Childbirth, illness, exhaustion. None of it paused the relentless forward motion required simply to survive the journey itself. What connects Sarah, Harriet, and countless women like Amelia Stewart Knight isn't a shared experience exactly, because their circumstances were radically, painfully different from one another. What connects them is a shared, quiet refusal to give up, even when every single circumstance surrounding them offered every reason imaginable to do exactly that. Most people don't realize just how much of American history was actually built, quite literally, on the backs of women exactly like these. Not the generals, not the politicians whose names fill history textbooks, the mothers keeping farms alive during impossible illness, the mothers preserving hope and dignity under conditions of forced bondage, the mothers giving birth on a moving wagon train and somehow, impossibly, continuing forward the very next day. There's a moment of unexpected heroism worth pausing on here, one recorded in a letter Sarah's daughter wrote decades later, long after both her parents had passed away. During that terrible winter of 1845, with Thomas critically ill and firewood running dangerously low, a neighbouring family, one Sarah had only a passing acquaintance with, arrived unannounced one bitter morning with a full wagon load of split wood. They said almost nothing. They simply unloaded it, checked quietly on Thomas's condition, and left again just as quickly, refusing any offer of payment or repayment of any kind. This is the quiet architecture of survival that rarely appears in grand historical narratives, not dramatic rescues, not sweeping heroic gestures, just ordinary people showing up for other ordinary people, because in a world this unforgiving, that was often the only real safety net that existed at all. As winter finally broke and spring arrived in 1846, Sarah's family had survived. Thomas was weakened but alive. The mules had survived. The farm somehow had survived too. But survival in this era was never really an ending point. It was simply the price of admission to face whatever difficult season came next. And as we move forward into the next part of this story, that exact truth is about to become undeniable for the entire country. Not just for individual families struggling through hard winters, but for an entire nation about to discover just how much more difficult its own reckoning was still going to become. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you woke up tomorrow with no hospital nearby, no reliable clean water, and no safety net beneath your family at all, would you even know how to survive? Most of us wouldn't, and that gap between what Sarah knew instinctively and what most of us have simply never had to learn tells us something important about exactly how much has changed, and maybe how much we've quietly lost along the way. Think about something as simple as food security. Sarah's family lived within a hair's breadth of disaster every single year, dependent entirely on a harvest that could be wiped out by drought, flood, or a single bad frost at the wrong moment. Today, most Americans are 3 trips to the grocery store away from feeling like an emergency is unfolding. But here's the uncomfortable mirror. Supply chain disruptions during recent years, whether from pandemic shutdowns or extreme weather events, gave millions of Americans a small, unsettling taste of what food insecurity can actually feel like. The difference is that Sarah's generation built their entire lives around that uncertainty, developing skills, route sellers, and community networks specifically designed to weather it. Many of us today have no equivalent skill set at all, no real plan beyond assuming the shelves will always be full. Now think about healthcare, because this mirror might be the most uncomfortable one of all. Sarah lost children to illnesses that today would require nothing more than a quick visit to urgent care and a round of antibiotics. That gap represents one of the genuine triumphs of the last 180 years. Vaccines, sanitation, modern medicine, all of it has saved more lives than almost any other development in human history. But here's what's remarkable. Even today, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, roughly 25 million Americans remain without health insurance, and rural communities across huge stretches of this same country still face doctor shortages severe enough that some patients drive hours for basic medical care. Sarah didn't have modern medicine. Many rural Americans today have modern medicine sitting just out of reach, blocked not by geography or knowledge, but by cost and access. It's a different kind of scarcity, but it's scarcity all the same. Let's talk about community, because this might be the sharpest mirror of them all. When Thomas fell dangerously ill that winter of 1845, neighbours showed up with firewood, unasked, expecting nothing in return. This wasn't unusual generosity. It was simply how survival worked. Communities in this era were bound together by genuine mutual interdependence, because nobody could realistically survive completely alone. Today, researchers studying American social patterns have documented a significant, measurable decline in close friendships and community involvement over the past several decades. Many Americans now report having few or no close friends they could call on in a real emergency. We've built a world with infinitely more convenience than Sarah ever had access to, and yet in some very real ways, considerably less genuine human connection to fall back on when things go wrong. What's remarkable is that Sarah's isolated Ohio farm, seemingly cut off from the rest of the world by miles of muddy, impassable roads, may have actually offered her a stronger, more reliable safety net of real relationships than many Americans have access to today, despite living surrounded by millions of other people. Now let's turn to something else, the information Sarah lacked versus the information we're drowning in. Sarah waited weeks, sometimes months, for news to reach her Ohio farm from Washington or from the frontier out west. When it finally arrived, it came through a newspaper, a travelling peddler, or a neighbour returning from town, filtered slowly through layers of retelling. We live in the exact opposite world now. Information arrives instantly, constantly, from every direction at once. And yet, somehow, Americans today report feeling just as uncertain, just as anxious about the state of the world as any generation that came before them. Most people don't realize that constant access to information doesn't necessarily produce more clarity. Sometimes it produces the opposite. Sarah faced genuine, life-threatening uncertainty with limited information. We face comparatively minor daily uncertainty, buried under an overwhelming non-stop flood of information. Different problems entirely, but strangely similar levels of underlying anxiety. Here's where this mirror gets genuinely personal and genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. The forces reshaping Sarah's world, expansion, economic inequality, deep political division over fundamental moral questions, none of that actually disappeared after the 1840s. It simply changed shape. Political division over deeply held moral questions still runs through American life today, sometimes dividing families and communities in ways that feel eerily similar to the tension Sarah witnessed building around slavery and westward expansion. Economic systems still concentrate enormous wealth and power in relatively few hands, while the people doing much of the actual physical and essential labour often see the smallest share of the resulting benefits. The specific issues have changed considerably. The underlying human patterns, unfortunately, have not changed nearly as much as we might like to believe. So here's the real question worth asking yourself. Would we actually do things differently today if we were placed in Sarah's exact circumstances? Or would we simply repeat the exact same patterns, dressed up in modern language and modern technology? Would we build the same kind of tight-knit, interdependent communities Sarah relied on for survival? Or have we become too comfortable, too self-sufficient in appearance only, to actually need each other in that same essential way? Would we recognize the early warning signs of a coming crisis, the way tensions over Texas and Oregon were quietly building years before anyone could see exactly where they were heading? Or are we right now living through our own version of that exact same quiet, gradual build-up, unable to fully recognize it simply because we're standing too close to see it clearly? I don't think there's a comfortable answer here, and I'm not sure there's supposed to be one. Sarah's generation faced enormous hardship without most of the tools, the medicine, or the technology we now take completely for granted. And yet they built farms, communities, and eventually an entire sprawling nation out of almost nothing but sheer determination and mutual reliance on one another. We've inherited nearly everything they built, along with plenty they never intended to pass down: the wealth, the land, the infrastructure. But also quietly some of the exact same unresolved tensions that were already simmering beneath the surface of their own daily lives back in 1843. The real mirror isn't really about candles versus electricity, or wagon trains versus highways. It's about whether we've actually grown wiser with all of this progress, or whether we've simply gotten better at disguising the exact same, very human problems Sarah's entire generation was already quietly wrestling with, right there beside their flickering hearth fires nearly 200 years ago. Historians still argue fiercely about this decade, and honestly, they probably always will. Because the 1840s refused to sit still long enough to be judged simply as one thing or another. Here's the first debate worth understanding clearly. Was westward expansion fundamentally an act of courage, or fundamentally an act of theft? One camp of historians emphasizes the genuine bravery, sacrifice and hardship endured by settlers like Sarah's neighbours and Narcissa Whitman. They point to the very real dangers of the Oregon Trail, the very real hunger, disease and death that families willingly faced in pursuit of a better future. From this angle, westward expansion represents human resilience and hope at its most extraordinary. Another camp of historians, drawing heavily on indigenous perspectives and primary sources that were long ignored by earlier generations of scholars, argues that this same expansion was, at its core, a sustained campaign of displacement and violence against nations who never consented to any of it. From this angle, the same wagon trains celebrated as symbols of American perseverance were also simultaneously instruments of dispossession. Both of these perspectives are supported by real historical evidence. Both are, in some sense, entirely true at once, and that's exactly what makes this such a genuinely difficult question to resolve. It's not a matter of one side having facts and the other having myths. It's a matter of the exact same set of facts, producing radically different moral conclusions depending on whose experience you centre in the telling. Here's a second ongoing debate, one that touches directly on Narcissa Whitman's story. Were missionaries like the Whitmans well-meaning victims of tragic misunderstanding, or were they active participants in a colonising project, regardless of their personal intentions? Some historians argue that judging historical figures by today's moral standards is fundamentally unfair, that Narcissa and Marcus Whitman acted according to the sincere, deeply held beliefs of their own time, and that their deaths represent a genuine tragedy born from cultural miscommunication and a devastating epidemic neither side fully understood. Other historians push back hard against this framing, arguing that regardless of personal sincerity, the practical effect of missionary settlement was to further indigenous displacement, and that centering sympathy on the Whitmans risks minimizing the far greater loss experienced by the Cayuse people who lost their land, their population, and eventually their independence entirely in the years that followed. Neither of these positions is simply wrong. This is one of those genuine, unresolved questions that historians continue to debate in academic journals to this day, without anything close to full consensus. Now here's a third debate, and this one cuts even deeper. How should we understand the relationship between northern industrial wealth and southern slavery during this exact decade? Some economic historians argue that northern complicity has been understated for generations, pointing to clear evidence that banks, shipping companies and textile mills throughout the North profited enormously and directly from a slave-based cotton economy, even while those same states had legally abolished slavery within their own borders. Other historians caution against collapsing this into a simple, uniform narrative of universal Northern guilt, pointing out that abolitionist movements were also genuinely powerful and growing throughout this exact same period, and that treating the entire North as equally complicit risks, erasing the real moral and political resistance that was actively building throughout this decade. Again, both of these things appear to be true simultaneously. Northern economic entanglement with slavery was real and significant. Northern resistance to slavery was also real and significant. Historical truth here isn't a single clean line. It's several contradictory threads, woven together into the exact same decade. Here's a debate closer to Sarah's own experience, one about everyday women's lives specifically. How much genuine agency did women like Sarah actually have within their own households and communities? Some historians emphasize the profound legal and social limitations women faced throughout this era. No right to vote, extremely limited property rights in most states, legal identity that was, in many important respects, absorbed entirely into a husband's identity once married. Other historians point to significant evidence of real, practical power women exercised within the domestic sphere, arguing that farm wives like Sarah often functioned as genuine economic partners, managing household finances, making critical decisions during a husband's illness or absence, and exercising far more day-to-day authority than the formal legal record alone would suggest. The honest answer likely sits somewhere between these two positions. Real legal powerlessness existed alongside real, practical influence, and the balance between those two truths probably varied enormously from household to household, family to family, decade to decade. Then there's the question of the frontier's psychological legacy, one that historians still wrestle with today. Did this era of expansion, hardship, and self-reliance produce a genuinely admirable strain of American independence and grit? Or did it produce a kind of national mythology that's been used ever since to justify inequality by suggesting that anyone who struggles simply hasn't worked hard enough? Some scholars argue the frontier experience genuinely shaped valuable American traits: real self-sufficiency, real community cooperation, real resilience under extraordinary hardship, traits that arguably still serve the country well today. Other scholars argue this same mythology has been weaponized repeatedly throughout American history, used to dismiss legitimate grievances about systemic inequality by insisting that pure individual effort alone was always the sole determining factor in Sarah's generation surviving, ignoring the genuine structural advantages and disadvantages that shaped different families' outcomes so dramatically. I'm not going to tell you which side of these debates is correct, because honestly, that's not really my place, and I'm not sure any single answer fully captures the complexity we're dealing with here. What I can tell you is this: the 1840s resist easy categorization in almost every single direction you approach them from. Heroic and tragic, hopeful and brutal, individually courageous and systemically unjust, often within the very same family, the very same year, sometimes even within the very same person. Sarah wasn't a symbol of anything. She was a woman trying to survive a difficult winter. Narcissa wasn't a villain or a saint. She was a woman acting on sincere conviction inside a system far larger and more destructive than she likely ever fully understood. Harriet wasn't simply a victim. She was a mother engaged in constant, quiet acts of resistance against a system designed specifically to break her. So here's the genuine question I want to leave you with, the one historians still argue about at conferences and in academic papers to this very day. When we tell the story of this decade, whose experience deserves to sit at the centre of it? Is it the settler crossing 2,000 miles of dangerous, uncharted country in pursuit of a better life? Is it the indigenous nation watching that same journey slowly, permanently reshape everything they'd ever known? Is it the enslaved mother living the harshest, most brutally honest version of what freedom's absence actually meant in this country? Or is it, somehow, impossibly, all of them at once, each one holding an equally valid, equally incomplete piece of the exact same sprawling, contradictory story? There isn't a clean answer waiting at the end of this question, and maybe, if we're being fully honest with ourselves, that's exactly the point. By 1850, just a handful of years after the moments we've been exploring together, the structural landscape of America had shifted in ways that would echo for more than a century afterward. Let's start with the most immediate consequence: war with Mexico. The tensions building throughout the mid-1840s, Texas annexation, aggressive westward expansion, a young nation convinced of its own destiny, erupted into open conflict in 1846. The Mexican-American War lasted nearly 2 years, and by the time it ended in 1848, the United States had gained an almost unimaginable amount of new territory. All of what's now California, Nevada, Utah, and large portions of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming ceded through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This single treaty expanded the size of the United States by more than 500,000 square miles. But it also reopened, almost immediately, the exact same explosive question that had already been simmering for decades. Would this new territory allow slavery, or would it remain free? That single question led directly to the Compromise of 1850, a fragile political agreement that admitted California as a free state while implementing a much harsher Fugitive Slave Act, one that legally compelled Northern citizens, regardless of their own personal beliefs, to actively assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. For a family like Harriet's, this new law made an already brutal system even more dangerous. Escape to the North no longer guaranteed real safety, because federal law now required Northern communities to participate directly in returning escaped individuals back into slavery. This wasn't compromise in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a temporary patch stretched tight over a fracture that was only continuing to widen underneath. Now let's look at what happened out west, in the exact territory Narcissa Whitman had helped establish American claims to. The Whitman Massacre in 1847 and the war that followed between American settlers and the KS Nation directly accelerated the process of formal territorial organization. Oregon became an official United States territory in 1848, setting the stage for eventual statehood in 1859. For the Cayuse and other indigenous nations throughout the Pacific Northwest, the consequences were severe and permanent. Treaties signed throughout the 1850s systematically stripped away enormous stretches of ancestral land, confining many nations to a fraction of the territory they'd once controlled entirely on their own terms. The pattern established here, missionary and settler expansion, followed by conflict, followed by formal government treaties, formal government seizure, repeated itself across nearly the entire American West throughout the remainder of the 19th century. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, families like Sarah's were experiencing a very different, though equally significant kind of structural change. Throughout the late 1840s, railroad construction was accelerating rapidly across the Midwest. By 1850, several thousand miles of track already connected communities that had previously depended entirely on wagon roads and river transport. This changed everything about daily rural life, though gradually rather than overnight. Goods that once took weeks to arrive could now arrive in days. News that once travelled at the speed of a horse now moved considerably faster. Farmers gained meaningfully improved access to distant markets, allowing families like Sarah's to sell surplus crops for real cash income, rather than relying almost entirely on subsistence farming and informal barter with neighbours. Public education was also beginning to expand significantly during this exact period. Horace Mann, working out of Massachusetts throughout the 1840s, championed what came to be known as the Common School movement, arguing forcefully that education should be free, universal, and available to all children, regardless of family income. By 1850, this movement had spread considerably beyond Massachusetts, though genuinely universal public education across the entire country remained, at this point, still decades away from full realization. For Sarah's own children, this shift meant that opportunities for formal schooling, while still limited compared to what we'd recognise today, were measurably better than what their own parents had ever had access to growing up. The temperance movement, which we touched on earlier, also achieved its first major legislative victory during this exact period. In 1851, Maine became the first state to pass a comprehensive law prohibiting the sale of alcohol, a law that came to be known nationally as the Maine Law. Within just a few years, a dozen other states had passed similar legislation. This wouldn't hold permanently. Many of these early prohibition laws were eventually repealed or significantly weakened, but it represented a genuinely significant structural shift in American attitudes toward alcohol, one that would echo forward for decades, eventually culminating in national prohibition nearly 70 years later. Perhaps the most consequential long-term shift, though, was happening quietly within the American labour movement itself. Throughout the 1840s, workers in industrial cities like Lowell had begun organising more formally than ever before. The Lowell Female Labour Reform Association, founded in 1844, represented one of the earliest organised labour movements, led specifically by women in American history, advocating for reduced working hours and improved factory conditions. While these early efforts achieved only limited success in the short term, they established organising tactics, petition drives, public testimony before state legislatures, coordinated work stoppages that would become foundational tools for the American labour movement over the following century. And then, of course, there's the consequence that towers over everything else in this decade: the unresolved question of slavery, which every single compromise throughout the 1840s and 50s only postponed rather than actually settled. By 1860, roughly a decade after the events we've been exploring together, the structural tensions building throughout this exact period, economic dependence on slave labour, political battles over new territories, deepening moral division between North and South, finally erupted into the Civil War, the deadliest conflict in all of American history, one that would ultimately claim more American lives than every other American war combined, before or since. The families we've followed throughout this story, people like Sarah, like Harriet, like the descendants of Narcissa's Oregon mission, all of them, in one way or another, would find their lives directly reshaped by this coming conflict, whether they lived to see it themselves or passed that reckoning forward to their own children instead. What's remarkable, looking back at all of this from where we stand today, is just how directly traceable so many of these consequences actually are. The specific boundary lines of Western states, the existence of a national public education system, the entire framework of federal labour law that eventually emerged from those first tentative organising efforts in places like Lowell, even certain patterns of regional economic inequality that persist, in modified form, well into our own time. None of it happened by accident, and very little of it happened quickly. It emerged, slowly and unevenly, out of exactly the kind of ordinary, difficult, contradictory daily life we've spent this entire story exploring together. Sarah never lived to see most of these long-term consequences fully play out, but the world her grandchildren would eventually inherit, one connected by railroads, shaped by public schools, still wrestling openly with the unfinished business of slavery and equality, was built directly out of the exact tensions and struggles unfolding quietly round her own hearth fire back in 1843. By the time Sarah reached her 50s, sometime in the early 1860s, the world around her had changed so completely that it must have felt at times almost unrecognisable. The quiet Ohio farm she and Thomas had built with nothing but sheer determination now sat within reach of a railroad line. Her children, who'd grown up hauling water by hand and reading by candlelight, were raising their own children in homes with actual glass windows shipped in from factories, cast iron stoves that made cooking dramatically safer and more efficient, and at least the possibility of a real doctor within a day's travel rather than a week's. But the deeper transformation wasn't really about technology at all. It was about what an entire generation had learned about endurance, and what they chose to pass forward because of it. Sarah's daughter, the same girl who'd learned to cook over an open hearth at 9 years old during her father's near-fatal illness, grew into a woman who insisted, with real determination, that her own daughters learn to read and write well beyond what basic literacy required. She'd lived through a childhood defined by uncertainty and constant physical labour, and she wanted something different, something more secure, for the next generation coming up behind her. This is one of the quiet, often overlooked transformations of this entire era. Parents who had survived genuine hardship didn't necessarily want their children to simply replicate that same hardship. Many of them pushed hard, in whatever ways were actually available to them, towards something a little easier, a little safer, a little more filled with genuine opportunity. Now let's turn to Harriet's story, because her transformation arc carries a weight entirely different from Sarah's, and arguably far more profound. We don't know Harriet's exact fate with certainty, since detailed records of most enslaved individuals from this era are tragically incomplete. But we know, through the broader historical record, what happened to millions of people who shared her exact circumstances. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation that reshaped it in 1863, followed by the 13th Amendment in 1865, finally formally ended slavery throughout the entire United States. For the children Harriet had secretly taught to read, if they survived long enough to see this moment, freedom arrived not as an abstract legal concept, but as a lived, tangible reality, however incomplete and however violently resisted by many parts of the country that followed. The transformation here wasn't gentle, and it wasn't complete. Reconstruction brought genuine progress alongside ferocious, often violent backlash. But the fundamental legal transformation, from human beings treated as property to human beings recognized, at least on paper, as full citizens, represents one of the most significant moral transformations in all of American history, one that traces its most immediate roots directly back to tensions already fully visible throughout the exact decade we've spent this story exploring. Out in Oregon country, the transformation took yet another distinct shape entirely. The Cayuse Nation, along with neighbouring tribes throughout the region, faced a transformation defined largely by loss. Land ceded through forced treaties. Traditional ways of life disrupted permanently by disease, displacement, and an ever-growing settler population that showed little interest in genuine coexistence. But transformation here also meant something else: resilience and cultural survival against enormous sustained pressure. Despite everything, Cayuse descendants and neighbouring tribes maintained their languages, their traditions, and their distinct identities, eventually organising formally as the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, a sovereign nation that continues to exist and govern its own affairs to this very day. This is a transformation arc that rarely gets the attention it deserves in mainstream historical narratives. Not simply a story of loss, though the loss was real and severe. Also a story of genuine, hard-won endurance across generations, carrying forward an identity that outside forces spent well over a century actively trying to erase. Now, back in the industrial cities of the North, the transformation looked different again. The Lowell Female Labour Reform Association and similar early organising efforts throughout the 1840s didn't achieve immediate sweeping victories, but they planted seeds that would grow slowly and unevenly across the following decades. By the late 19th century, organised labour movements had grown dramatically more powerful and more sophisticated, eventually achieving genuine legal protections around working hours, workplace safety, and basic labour rights that would have seemed almost unimaginable to a young factory worker in 1844 Lowell. The young women who'd once stood at those looms 12 or 13 hours a day couldn't have known that their early efforts were laying essential groundwork for transformations that wouldn't fully materialise until long after most of them had passed away. But that's precisely how meaningful historical change often actually works. Quietly, incrementally, built by people who never personally lived to witness the full result of their own sacrifice. So how did America itself change as a collective identity throughout this transformation? Before this decade, America had largely understood itself as a young, still-forming experiment, uncertain of its exact borders, its exact identity, its exact place in the broader world. By the 1860s, after Mexican War expansion, after the brutal moral reckoning of the Civil War, after decades of westward migration reshaping the entire geography of the country, America had become something distinctly different. Larger, more industrialized, more undeniably and more painfully aware of its own deep internal contradictions. What's remarkable is that many of the exact same tensions we've traced throughout this story, economic inequality, racial injustice, the uneasy relationship between individual liberty and collective responsibility, didn't actually resolve during this transformation. They simply evolved into new forms, ones that the following generations would need to keep confronting, again and again, in their own time. Sarah lived long enough to see much of this transformation unfold, though she likely never fully grasped the entire sweeping scope of it from her own particular vantage point out on that Ohio farm. She saw her children grow into adults who had genuinely more opportunity than she'd ever had. She saw railroads connect communities that had once felt impossibly isolated from one another. She likely heard at some point news of the Civil War's end and the formal abolition of a slave system that had existed in some form for the entire span of her own lifetime and many generations before it. Whether she fully understood just how directly her own quiet, difficult decade had helped set all of these transformations into motion, we simply can't know for certain. But we can know this: the daily struggles she faced, the survival instincts she developed, the community bonds she maintained through genuine crisis, all of it became part of the raw material out of which an entirely different America was eventually built. This is what transformation actually looks like when you trace it honestly, rather than through the tidy, simplified version we often receive in textbooks. Not a single dramatic turning point, but millions of individual lives, quietly adapting, resisting, enduring, and occasionally triumphing, each one contributing some small, largely invisible thread to an enormous, complicated tapestry stretched across generations. Sarah's story, Harriet's story, the story of the Chaos Nation, the story of that first generation of organised factory workers in Lowell. None of these stories concluded neatly by the 1860s. They simply transformed into the next chapter, carrying forward both the genuine progress and the unfinished, unresolved business that this remarkable, contradictory decade had left behind for every generation that came after it. There's a lesson buried in this story, and I don't think it announces itself the way lessons usually do. It doesn't arrive wrapped in a neat quote or a tidy moral. It arrives quietly, the way most real wisdom does, earned through thousands of small, difficult mornings rather than a single dramatic revelation. Here's what I think Sarah's life, and Harriet's life, and Narcissa's life actually teach us, if we're willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to really listen. The first thing worth noticing is this: none of these women waited for certainty before they acted. Sarah didn't know, on any given morning, whether her children would survive the week ahead. She didn't know whether the harvest would come in strong enough, whether illness would strike, whether the mules would stay healthy through another brutal winter. And yet she got up anyway, every single morning, and did the next necessary thing in front of her. Harriet didn't know whether her secret efforts to teach her children to read would ever matter, whether freedom would ever actually arrive in her own lifetime or her children's. She acted anyway, preserving dignity and knowledge in the smallest available spaces, because waiting for guaranteed outcomes wasn't a privilege her circumstances ever offered her. There's something worth sitting with here about our own relationship with uncertainty today. We often wait. We wait for the right moment, the right information, the right guarantee of success before we're willing to commit to something difficult. Sarah's generation, in a world offering almost no guarantees of any kind, simply couldn't afford that particular luxury. The second piece of wisdom is quieter and maybe even more uncomfortable. Real resilience rarely looks dramatic while it's actually happening. We tend to imagine historical courage as something loud and visible, a dramatic speech, a daring escape, a single defining moment captured in a painting or a photograph. But most of the courage we've traced throughout this story looked almost invisible in the moment itself. Sarah quietly breaking ice off a water trough at 4 a.m. during her husband's illness. Harriet quietly teaching her children letters by candlelight, saying nothing about the enormous risk she was taking. A neighbour quietly delivering firewood without a word of explanation or expectation of thanks. Most people don't realise that history's true engine isn't usually the dramatic headline moment. It's this: thousands of small, unglamorous acts of endurance and quiet decency, repeated consistently by people who never once considered themselves particularly brave or remarkable. There's a third piece of wisdom here too, one connected directly to the community bonds we explored earlier in Sarah's story. Nobody in this era survived entirely alone, and I don't think that was actually a weakness of their circumstances. I think it might have been one of their genuine strengths. We live today in a world that often prizes independence above almost everything else, self-sufficiency, standing entirely on your own. But Sarah's entire survival depended on a dense web of mutual obligation, neighbours who showed up with firewood, communities that raised barns together, families who understood, without needing to be told, that today's help offered would likely become tomorrow's help received. What if genuine strength isn't actually about never needing anyone else? What if it's about building relationships solid enough that needing someone else doesn't feel like failure, but simply feels like being fully, honestly human? Here's a fourth insight, this one drawn more directly from the larger historical forces we uncovered. Systems of power rarely announce themselves clearly while they're actively operating. The economic machinery connecting northern textile mills to southern cotton fields wasn't hidden through some elaborate conspiracy. It was hidden simply through distance, complexity, and a kind of collective unwillingness to look too closely at uncomfortable connections. This pattern hasn't disappeared. It's simply taken on new forms in our own time. The products we buy, the systems we depend on, the comfort we enjoy, all of it still connects, often quite directly, to labour and consequences happening somewhere just out of our immediate view. Sarah's generation couldn't easily trace these connections even if they'd wanted to. We often can, if we're actually willing to look. The fifth piece of wisdom might be the hardest one to fully accept, and it connects back to that great unresolved debate we sat with earlier in this story. Moral progress is rarely a straight line, and it's almost never fully finished within a single generation's lifetime. Sarah's generation didn't resolve the question of slavery. They passed an intensified version of that exact struggle directly forward to their own children. The labour organisers in Lowell didn't achieve fair working conditions in their own lifetimes. They built a foundation that later generations would need to keep building on top of, decade after decade. This isn't actually a discouraging thought. Not entirely. It's closer to a genuine, sobering piece of wisdom. Meaningful change is often generational, not immediate. The seed Sarah's generation planted, sometimes without even realizing they were planting anything at all, took root and grew in ways they themselves never lived to witness. What strikes me most, thinking about everything we've explored together throughout this story, is how much these hard-won lessons still apply directly to our own lives today, even though almost everything about our daily circumstances has changed so completely. We still face genuine uncertainty, even if it rarely resembles Sarah's uncertainty about surviving a brutal winter. We still have opportunities for quiet, unglamorous acts of resilience and decency that rarely make headlines, but genuinely shape the people around us. We still depend on community far more than our cultural mythology of rugged individual independence generally likes to admit. We still benefit, often without fully realizing it, from systems built on labour and consequences happening well outside our immediate view. And we're still, whether we fully recognize it or not, in the middle of our own unresolved, ongoing moral and political struggles that will likely pass forward, at least partially unfinished, to the next generation coming up behind us. Sarah never set out to teach anyone a lesson. She was simply trying to survive a difficult season, one difficult morning at a time, without any sense that her ordinary private struggle might eventually mean anything to people living almost 2 centuries later. But that's often exactly how the deepest wisdom actually works. It's rarely delivered directly, wrapped up neatly in a lesson plan or a motivational quote. It's discovered quietly, sitting patiently within the ordinary details of someone else's difficult, honest life, waiting for someone else someday to notice it and to carry a small piece of it forward into their own. I want you to think for a moment about who you actually are because of people like Sarah, not in some vague, sentimental sense, in a real, direct, traceable way. Because whether your own family arrived in this country in the 1700s or the 2010s, the America you're living in right now was shaped, in fundamental ways, by exactly the kind of ordinary, difficult decade we've spent this entire story exploring together. If you're an American watching this right now, some real tangible piece of your daily life traces directly back to decisions and struggles unfolding in exactly this era. The public school your children might attend exists because of movements championed by people like Horace Mann throughout the 1840s. The basic legal protections around your own working hours exist because of organising efforts, however small and however unsuccessful in the short term, that began with women in places like Lowell. Even the very shape of the country you live in, its actual borders, stretching all the way to the Pacific, traces directly back to expansion and conflict unfolding during this exact decade. You didn't choose any of this. None of us did. We were simply born into a country already shaped by choices, sacrifices, and injustices made generations before we ever arrived. But here's where this gets genuinely personal, rather than simply historical. What does it actually mean to be part of a story this complicated? Because if you're an American today, you're not just the inheritor of Sarah's resilience and quiet endurance. You're also, Whether you're comfortable acknowledging it or not, the inheritor of Harriet's stolen labour and the profits that labour generated for an entire economic system. You're the inheritor of land taken from the Chaos Nation and hundreds of other indigenous nations across this continent, land that became farms, then towns, then cities, then the entire physical foundation of the country you live in today. This isn't about guilt, and I don't think it's productive to frame it that way. Guilt implies personal responsibility for choices you never actually made yourself. What I think this is really about is something closer to honest acknowledgement, understanding the full, complicated inheritance you've actually received, rather than only the comfortable parts of it. What's remarkable is how much of American identity has always existed in exactly this kind of tension. We tell ourselves stories about freedom and opportunity, and those stories are genuinely, meaningfully true for millions of people throughout our history. Sarah really did build something out of almost nothing. Her descendants really did have more genuine opportunity than she ever had access to herself. But we also have to hold, simultaneously, the other side of that exact same story. Freedom and opportunity for some was often built directly on the denial of freedom and opportunity for others. This isn't a contradiction that cancels out the genuine, hard-won parts of the American story. It's simply the fuller, more complicated truth sitting underneath the simplified version we're often more comfortable telling ourselves. I think this is actually what makes the American identity so genuinely distinct and so genuinely difficult compared to older nations with more singular, unified historical narratives. We're not one simple story. We've never actually been one simple story, not even for a single decade. We're Sarah's endurance and Harriet's resistance and the Chaos Nation's survival against overwhelming odds, all existing simultaneously within the exact same sprawling, contradictory national identity. None of these threads cancels out the others. All of them, together, are what actually built the country millions of us call home today. So who did we become, collectively, because of everything this decade set into motion? We became a country that keeps having the same fundamental argument generation after generation about who genuinely belongs, about what freedom actually means in practice rather than just on paper, about how much we actually owe each other as fellow citizens sharing the exact same difficult, unfinished project. We became a country capable of extraordinary resilience, the kind Sarah demonstrated surviving winter after winter with almost nothing but sheer determination. And we became a country capable of extraordinary cruelty, the kind embedded directly into the system that controlled Harriet's entire life and the lives of millions like her. Both of these things are genuinely, permanently part of who we are, not one instead of the other, both together, held in the same uncomfortable ongoing tension that Sarah, Harriet and Narcissa were all already living inside, whether they fully recognized it themselves or not. Here's something worth asking yourself directly. Sitting with this story now, nearly 200 years removed from the actual events themselves, when future generations look back at our own decade, the one we're actually living through right now, what will they see? Will they see quiet resilience, communities pulling together through genuine hardship, the way we can now recognize in Sarah's story? Will they see courageous, quiet resistance against systems that deny basic dignity to entire groups of people, the way we can now recognize in Harriet's story? Will they see complicated, well-intentioned people caught inside forces far larger than their own individual choices, the way we can now recognize in Narcissa's story? Or will they see something we can't fully recognize yet ourselves, precisely because we're still standing too close to it, still living inside our own version of exactly the kind of quiet, gradual historical build-up that Sarah's generation experienced without fully understanding where it was actually heading? I think that's the real weight of collective identity. Not a single, tidy story we get to tell ourselves about who we are. A continuously unfolding argument, carried forward by ordinary people making difficult choices inside circumstances they never fully chose for themselves, generation after generation, each one adding another layer of complexity onto everything that came before them. Sarah's story became part of America's story. Harriet's story became part of America's story. Narcissa's story became part of America's story. And right now, in ways we probably can't fully see clearly yet, your own story and mine are quietly becoming part of that exact same unfinished ongoing project too. Somewhere in Ohio, the ground where Sarah's cabin once stood is probably a soybean field now, or maybe a quiet residential street, or maybe just an unmarked stretch of grass beside a county road nobody thinks twice about. There's no plaque there, no marker, nothing to tell you that a woman once broke ice off a well at 4 a.m. on that exact spot. Certain of almost nothing except that the fire needed lighting and the children needed feeding, one more time before the sun came up. That's the part of history that never makes it into the textbooks. Not the wars, not the treaties, not the famous names we've been trained to recognize. The actual physical ground where ordinary lives were lived out, one exhausting, uncertain day at a time, until eventually, inevitably, it simply became ground again, waiting quietly for the next layer of forgetting to settle over it. Someday, the ground beneath your own life will do the exact same thing. Here's what I think is worth sitting with as we come to the end of this particular story together. Sarah couldn't see the Civil War coming. Harriet couldn't know with any real certainty that emancipation would eventually arrive within her own children's lifetime. Narcissa couldn't have imagined the war her death would help trigger, or the treaties that would follow it, stripping away nearly everything the Chaos Nation had once called their own. None of them could see it, and yet all of it was already quietly assembling itself around them, decision by decision, tension by tension, while they were simply trying to survive whatever ordinary difficulty stood directly in front of them that particular day. We're not so different, standing here in our own moment. Whatever quiet, gradual forces are currently reshaping our own future, the ones we can't yet fully name or fully see, they're almost certainly already in motion right now, embedded somewhere inside decisions and tensions that feel, to us, like nothing more than ordinary daily life. Maybe it's happening in the choices we're making about the resources we're using up faster than the planet can quietly replace them. Maybe it's happening in the widening gap between those with genuine security and those without much of a safety net at all. Maybe it's happening in ways that won't become clearly visible for another 20, 50, 100 years, the same way Sarah's decade only became fully legible once the Civil War had already arrived to make its underlying tensions completely undeniable. We are, in other words, exactly where they were, standing inside a moment we can't fully see the shape of yet, simply because we're still living directly inside it. There's a strange kind of comfort buried in that thought too, if you're willing to sit with it long enough to find it. Sarah didn't need to see the whole arc of American history clearly in order to matter within it. She just needed to break the ice off that well one more morning. She just needed to nurse Thomas through one more dangerous week. She just needed to hold her family together through one more difficult season, without any guarantee at all that any of it would eventually add up to something larger. It did add up to something larger, though. Not because she planned it that way, but simply because that's how history actually works. Quietly, invisibly, one ordinary act of endurance stacked on top of another, until eventually, decades later, someone looks back and finally sees the shape of the whole pattern. So maybe that's the real inheritance worth carrying forward from everything we've explored together in this story. Not a lesson about what specifically to do next, because none of us can actually see far enough ahead to know that with any real certainty. Just this: the quiet, stubborn insistence on doing the next necessary thing, even inside genuine uncertainty. The willingness to show up for a neighbour without waiting to be asked. The refusal to let comfort completely erase the memory of what came before us. The sacrifices, the injustices, the quiet acts of resistance, all of it, held together at once, without flattening any of it into something simpler than it actually was. Somewhere, right now, in a house you'll never visit, in a life you'll never personally witness, someone is quietly living through their own version of Sarah's difficult winter, Harriet's quiet resistance, Narcissa's uncertain journey towards something she believes in but cannot fully see the ending of yet. They don't know they're living inside history either. None of us ever really do, not while it's actually happening. But someday, someone will look back at this exact moment, the one you're sitting in right now, listening to these very words, and they'll try to understand what it actually felt like to be alive inside it. And the only honest answer, the same one Sarah, Harriet and Narcissa would have given if you could somehow ask them directly, is this: it just felt like an ordinary day, right up until it didn't. That's what everyday life in 1840s America really looked like. Quiet, uncertain, achingly human. If stories like this one help your mind settle at night, you're already home. This is whispered history, where the past gets to breathe a little longer. Rest easy tonight, and somewhere, someone is already living the quiet history you'll wonder about someday.